Hey, welcome to Transform Your Workplace. I'm Brandon Laws. This is the podcast where we explore ideas and stories that help you create a thriving workplace where people can do their best work. This show is brought to you by Xenium HR. Xenium's complete HR plus payroll solution unites HR, payroll, and benefits into one seamless system backed by a dedicated team that actually knows your business. It's the support you need to stay compliant, care for your people, and free up time to focus on growth. Learn more at xeniumhr.com. Today, my guest is Barry Wolfe, author of It's All in Your Head: Why Psychology Doesn't Help Your Workforce Deliver Value and What Can. In this conversation, Barry challenges the way organizations lean on personality tests and psychology-driven tools, showing how they can often mislead more than they can help. We dig into the history of bad workplace science, why leaders still cling to it, and most importantly, how to replace it with a value-centric approach. Here's what you'll take away from the conversation: why popular assessments can backfire in hiring and promotion, how to define and measure value so your people know exactly how to win, and simple practices like success maps that give employees clarity from day one. All right, let's jump in. Here's my conversation with Barry Wolfe. Barry, it is such a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace. Thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, heck, thanks a lot for having me, Brandon. Really appreciate it.
You wrote a book. It's called It's All in Your Head: Why Psychology Doesn't Help Your Workforce Deliver Value and What Can. I was telling you before we started recording, I'm like, this is a very smart book, and you challenged me to hopefully put together what would be a good conversation. So I want to kick off. The intro, you open up with Christine.
Yeah.
And this painful rejection letter she got. I think she killed the interviews. At least she thought she did. The quote that I wrote down: they had rejected Christine because the personality test showed she wouldn't be a fit with the company culture.
Yeah.
End quote. How did that moment crystallize the core argument of this book?
That's a great opening question. It's a perfect anecdote for, you got a great person. It wasn't just an interview. It was an interview in the same company she was working for, just a different office, where she had a track record of being very successful, well regarded, and by all accounts in terms of the career record, the touch points with the boss, she was a terrific person in the organization. But this impersonal, supposedly objective product of science comes back and says, she's not a fit, and it's the same place. So it just highlights, especially in HR, for a field that's supposed to be about people touch, and we care about individuals and we take care of people, but the idea that it can all be trumped because of somebody asking some questions and processing them a certain, probably obscure way, and coming back and saying, here's a different answer, and that's what determines the decision about a person. And I think I got a lot of those stories along the way, but that one I think just really highlights in a paragraph or so what's wrong with how we're applying this stuff. So
yeah, I think you do a good job in the intro, just kind of setting up the science and the psychology and what's maybe flawed about some of it, and get us to think differently. But part one of the book, you really take us through a history lesson of psychology and some bad science throughout the years. And in chapter one, you talk about Queen Victoria, and contrary to the BBC drama, she actually ordered multiple phrenology readings for her children. What is that real life enthusiasm for what was bad science tell us about our readiness in the workplace, about embracing fashionable people tools?
Nice phrase. You can stop there. I think what it says above all is we're all looking for somebody to show us some kind of insight about ourselves, about people around us. We're looking for some kind of definitive guidance that, at the risk of getting too deep into this, it goes back to, the augurs in the ancient world, looking for meaning in chicken bones. We all want that inside highly reliable insight into ourselves or the world, whatever. And even though I think it's so fascinating, the story of phrenology comes just really very shortly after the dawn of, comparatively shortly after the dawn of post Enlightenment science, so kind of the real sort of science that we would know. And yet, even as we're breaking out of that, and in so many ways, the idea that we could do the same thing with people was just so incredibly attractive. And there were people who could just jump all over that and create, I don't know that any of them thought they were pulling something over on people. I really don't think that was the case at all, but I think they believed that that's what they were doing, and everybody loved it. And it was not everybody, but a lot of people, a lot more people than we would have thought. In fact, in my research, I was shocked at how big of a deal phrenology had been in the popular culture in our country, and in other parts of the world, and how long it persisted. But we all still, even for the post Enlightenment world, we think of ourselves as modern, and we, shake off old prejudices, old superstitions or beliefs. But at the end of the day, we still are just like those folks in the sense, above all, maybe, that we still have the same tendencies to see what we want to see. And I think it persists right into the workplace. I don't know how many anecdotes like this you want to hear, but I could share with you one person who read my book and reached out to me about it, who had said her previous HR person, good sized business, successful place. The president of the business, though, had gone through a string of personality tests because he was absolutely convinced that somewhere out there was the test that all he has to do is subject somebody to those really couple of key questions, and he's just going to know whether they're going to be awesome in his business or not. And he just went through a slew of these. And of course, it was El Dorado. And the funny thing is how we think, to the extent that anybody thinks about this at all, I guess, we want to think, oh, it's those HR people and they're just such suckers, and there's all this touchy feely stuff and they don't really think. But again, in my research for this part of the book, I was stunned at how, since the outset, it's really the people at the top that are pushing this stuff. Just like this guy, in the 2010s, guys in the 1920s they were the ones that were embracing all this and still do.
In chapter 2, you give us a big history lesson on applied psychology in business. And you wrote that, and I quote, "After a few years of exploration, psychologists' sole consensus was that they couldn't define intelligence, let alone establish its importance in a job. For that matter, psychologists couldn't agree on what they meant by personality or even what a psychological test actually was," end quote. Why do you think these assessments hold so much weight in today's workplace? Like you're just saying, people at the top, HR professionals, you rely so heavily on these personality and skill assessments. I mean, I see it all the time. Why do you think that we rely so heavily on them?
There's a couple of reasons. One is because when these tools are all marketed, I should back up, by the way, if I could just be clear about one thing. I mentioned this in the introduction, but when I talk about psychology, I'm talking about applied psychology. I don't really know anything about clinical psychology. I don't know anything about abnormal psychology.
Thank you
so
for
I
clarifying.
haven't got a clue. I know people who said they've gone to psychologists and it's really helped them. And as I say, it's not for me to tell them they weren't. So, so in any case, I think that in the workplace, people really they believe the marketing. And when we say this is science, they think it split the atom. We pretty much eradicated polio. We can decipher the mind and personality with a couple of yes or no questions or so forth. Is that. And if I could play a little psychologist, I guess, in a way, I think part of it is also that there is a significant swath of human resources folks that has ridden these tools to a seat at the table. This has been what gives them a certain degree of authority in the workplace. People, they're the dispensers of, kind of reading the soul or so forth, or making these very definitive, this person isn't any good at that, and we should use this person there, or so forth. And everybody's so appreciative of the gift. I know people like that. So I think there's a certain chunk of that, and it's working out so well for everybody that nobody really wants to kind of ask, or they think it's working out so well for everybody, that nobody wants to ask, well, is this for real? And what's quite remarkable, by the way, is again, since I got this published, I heard from so many people, some folks who were kind enough to leave reviews of the book, who are in some cases they're senior people in very large corporations who are being told they have to use these things, and below that, the people that are passing these things out, there are people who are just asking, what the heck good is any of this stuff? Why am I jumping through these hoops? And they clearly are not getting very satisfactory answers to any of this.
I'm sure many people who are listening to this have heard of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You have a chapter dedicated to it's Abraham Maslow's world, and you're just working in it.
Yep.
That pyramid is in books, it's in boardrooms, and many people cite it. You argue that there's missing evidence for this actually being accurate. Maybe just share your opinion on Maslow's hierarchy of needs and why maybe it might be flawed.
Well, what's interesting is, by the way, that's my single favorite chapter of part one. I worked my tail off on that one. I would spend more time on it than anything, but I really like that chapter. But whatever that's worth. But anyway, it's not even so much my thought on it. It's the fact that there are so many psychologists going back to the 1960s and in the 70s that were attempting to empirically demonstrate its validity, which Maslow never tried to do. He had no interest in that, as a matter of fact. He just wanted to sit in the room and make theories and have other people validate them for him. So he never validated it himself. And it wasn't, and he wrote this stuff, he postulated around the 1930s. So it wasn't until, the late 60s going into the early 70s, people were actually trying to put this to the test. And they were finding they could identify relationships between this or that piece of it. But overall, it just didn't really explain anything. And yet here we are today, depending how you want to count it, 50, 60 years down the road. And it's still the one piece of psychology. Everybody knows who Maslow was. Everybody knows about that pyramid. And as you learned in the book, psychologists even call it Maslow's pyramid. Maslow didn't create that pyramid. He didn't come up with a geometric representation of the theory about anything. It was people afterwards, and it was all done. The biggest impetus was actually business consultants that were trying to sell clients on how smart they were. And, the first guy that came up with the first version of the pyramid was trying to use it as a way of talking about, compensation programs. So he wasn't trying to represent, the complexities of the human individual. He's just trying to sell his stuff, and that's all it's been used for ever since. And decades have gone by. It's been shown this, and people just don't want to hear it. They still want to talk about it. They want to use it, as you saw in my book. Some applications of trying to. We talk about the self-actualization concept, and people talking about how to self-actualize your workforce. Read what Maslow actually had to say about self-actualization and just step back from that. I mean, I'm sorry, with all due respect to that person who's very smart in it, but that's ridiculous. Like, if you think through what you're trying to say for that, how are you supposed to quote unquote self-actualize a group of people? And when you look at, again, like, they're not wonderful people. They can be moody, and they can be, resist actually efforts to join a larger culture. Why do you want that? How is that going to, improve shareholder value or something? It's nonsense. I'm sorry, but we're just going through the days thinking about these and talking about this, and it's just gibberish. I'm sorry. Look, I as I point out in the book, if you sit down and read A Theory of Human Motivation, I gotta say I was blown away to just read it. I mean, the guy is an incredible writer. I have no doubt, that's one of the reasons it persisted so long. I read a lot more Maslow than gets in the book. I would have loved to have met the guy, quite honestly. He's a fascinating fella. I don't think he's right, but when you kind of get your head around what he's saying, you got to step back and say, that is really impressive. You thought of that. I mean, I'm not trying to be funny. I don't think it's right, but that doesn't mean I can't look back and say, boy, he took a shot at pulling together some big concepts, and you got to give him credit for the shot.
I love it. I think it's the next chapter, the competency vortex. You cite research, which is pretty striking. It shows IQ predicts job performance no better than 0.03. So what keeps firms pouring tens of thousands of dollars into competency models when the math doesn't even add up. Like, this is hard data, empirical data.
Yeah. Yeah. Don't take my word for any of this stuff. I mean, I dug it up and, it's all in the bibliography. But, I think it just comes back to, again, even up to this day. I mean, that finding was talking about America, again, late 60s, early 70s. But nobody seems to care, frankly, into the 21st century. We just still take it as, that this is all the real deal. And again, there's a lot of people selling it. They're fabulous. I mean, you're a marketing guy, right? I mean, they're fabulous at marketing these things. And that's what people are reading and reacting to because they want it. They want it. And even into our present day, you quoted that, the symposium from the 1920s, as I point out later on. I mean, even in the 21st century, 100 years on, they still don't really know what intelligence is. They don't know what personality is.
There's I think this is on the marketing side of things, but there's a company, I'm not going to name them, but there's a company that shows a certification process that I think when you dig deeper, it's that they trust their clients that the data that they provide are accurate, and that's what the certification is bound on.
Yes.
So I'm thinking about it from a buyer's perspective. Like, what safeguards can we put in place before we buy into this stuff?
Yeah.
We spend a lot of money on these assessments and compensation.
Can I just clarify one little thing to what you're referring to? So,
yeah.
One chapter talks about what was called this, depending on who you read, this scandal/crisis in psychology in the beginning of 2010, when a very, very respected psychologist published a paper, the capstone of his career, in which he, using perfectly accepted research techniques, demonstrated that people have psychic powers. And it touched off a real firestorm. How could this very, very respected psychologist, using all the techniques that are considered perfectly appropriate, by which, things are published every day, how could he come up with a conclusion that's just ridiculous? And that's part of the problem. And it's touched off a huge, for a decade now, controversy in that world. And there's been a real attempt to better understand what kind of techniques they're actually using in this kind of research. And people are trying to stop, frankly, the gaming of the system around these things. But all of that, so the reality is just simply, so what does that mean for these, going back to your question, what does that mean for, applied psychology products that companies are buying and using every day? Well, those people don't have to show their work. That's all protected as intellectual property.
Right.
The certification firm you're talking about is one of the, I won't, you can read it in the book, but we won't talk about it here, but one very, very popular, widely used behavioral/personality assessment advertises on their website that their product is certified. It's the same certification process used in the European Psychological Association for kind of valid tools. And I reached out to these people. It's a company in Norway. I talked with emails with Kirsten and Rachel and Cecile, and they're wonderful people. And I just wanted to ask them, does your certification process mean that these more questionable research, that the data is not being massaged using these more questionable techniques that have been, exposed, I guess you could say, for the last several years? We had to have some correspondence, honestly, where they were thinking I was trying to poke at them. And I'm saying, listen, I'm not questioning the validity of your certification. I'm not implying it's a scam. I'm not saying these people are liars. I'm just trying to understand, what does it mean? And they basically came back and said, we take the data, we certify the methodologies they use based on the data. We just assume that that's all correct. So, are they playing with this stuff like anybody else is? I have no idea. But, a lot of their colleagues in academia have been for quite a while. And again, because this is all protected and nobody in the business world probably has even thought about it, they don't have to. There's nobody saying, we got to go clean this up. And why would anybody listen to me? So they're just, I guess, going to just keep buying this stuff and taking it all at face value.
Well, I think so. In part one of the book, you really do a good job. And we talked a little bit about it here. Part one of the book, you really shine a light on the skepticism that people should have about these methods. Part two, you talk about how do we shift from the psychology-driven label or methodology of helping our people succeed and our businesses succeed, to value-centric actions and turning people from B players to A players. And I think you posed a really good question in the beginning of the part two. Is you say, I think there's no more important leadership challenge than this. How do you help every employee help your business succeed? And I think if you start with that question, then you might be more open to some of the ideas you're talking about in part two. So where'd you come up with the value-centric actions idea? And I know you have like 9 parts to it. Maybe just highlight a few of those and we'll dive in.
Well, in a nutshell, I got interested in this actually, something along these lines. The very first business book I read, which was the genesis for that quote, by the way, was Peter Drucker's The Effective Executive, which is, to me, I think it's still one of the best business books ever written. I mean, if your listeners have never read Peter Drucker, read anything he ever wrote because he's brilliant. But in The Effective Executive,
yeah, it's a great book. I love that book.
You do, yeah, you too. It's a little book, and it's just
I do.
phenomenal. And in that book, he says a manager's success or failure is wholly dependent upon his abilities to accomplish his objectives through others. And that has been one of the things that's just resonated with me, my whole career. Along those lines, we don't have to go through kind of how I became an apostate from psychology, I guess, unless you really, I don't think it's that fascinating. But anyway, but I was always kind of skeptical of this stuff as I was, I was encountering it, being told to use it in various things. And I really started to think about it. I wanted to think about it a lot more in terms of how do we take the guesswork out of this? Because we have managers, we're wanting to do performance appraisals, recommend raises, and so forth. And we look at performance appraisals we're using, and as I make a reference to this, it's like if you look at, we're asking them to rate people on initiative and commitment to quality. It's like, look, this is a psychological profile. This isn't a performance thing, Our customers don't care. And so how do we come up with an alternative around that? So I've been playing with permutations of this stuff, ever since the 90s, I guess, kind of off and on. And that when COVID hit, like a lot of folks, I found myself with, shall we say, more time on my hands than I would have cared to have. So it gave me at least an opportunity, life hands you lemons, you make lemonade, right? So it gave me a chance to really sit down and just lock the door and stare at a piece of paper a lot and think about really, how would this work? And what am I really talking about here? And I really did think of it, as I mentioned in the book, in terms of what if you just take all of that stuff that we think about and talk about people and just throw it all away and clean slate, start over. As I mentioned in my, I started working when I was for my dad in a manufacturing company when I was 13 years old. And I was driving a forklift before I was old enough to drive a car. And I literally grew up in business and manufacturing and all that kind of stuff. And I sat at the dinner table with the boss, and knew some things about, and then I ended up working for him, the HR guy. And so I learned a lot of stuff about just at a very, very early age, what drives people crazy? What's the boss complain about? As do all my bosses, yours probably does too, and so forth. I really started to think about this also in terms of how do we address these things? I have a chapter, as about the same page kind of thing. And I was really struck with this because I would listen to the bosses, like everybody always, they're at one point or other, they're just, it's the two of us and they're ranting about this manager, that person, we can't get this, we can't get that fixed. And they all come back to say, we just got to get everybody on the same page. And I thought, and I would think for years, like, we've got a strategic plan. We've got a mission statement. We've got core values. We got a vision statement. What is this fabled page, that everyone unto which we almost begotten that we're not having? And I really had thought it can't be one more page on top of all the rest of these things. It just can't be. So I really just try to think about it going back to, what's kind of business 101. Why does it all exist? It's all about creating value. It's not, and when you really hug that idea for dear life, and just how you think through everything else we talk about and work through, a lot of things, it's hard to kind of clear away, everything you've been doing since you started this kind of stuff, and I've been at it longer than a lot of folks. But when you do that, you really do start to think about really, how do you just build it around simply that, even from the standpoint of just at the business, just, all right, we're all here to create value. What value? How do you start thinking about, and how do you define value? The MBAs, I'll say, well, it's money is the reward for value creation. Okay. So what do people give you money for? And we all want to go right to the customer. But of course, when you think about what's the president complain about, it's not just the customer, that in terms of, they're worried about the investors that give them money. The bank gives you money. And you give the company money in the sense of I'm going to forgo, another raise for myself because we got to buy another CAD station or whatever. So when you figure out what are all these things that create value in the business, and then what are the results you deliver by which you're creating that. And it's really, really, that's simple. But I would tell you, I've been doing it with some clients, and getting there is really, really hard. And it takes a lot of hard thinking. And I don't, I've worked for nothing but smart people, really smart people with a lot of integrity, but they just don't like to sit down and shut the door and think really, really hard for a long time. God bless them all, but that's just the way it is. But I will tell you, when we start thinking through these things, as I was, sharing with you, it's like funny from the standpoint of, psychology stuff, but they become these really intense sessions where it's like, why did you take out that second mortgage and want to do all this? And why do you not be with your kids, and all these things? And what do you want for your community? And what did you want for your customers and all those things? And we drill it down into as few words as possible. I mentioned in there, like I have a little bit of one of these, and it's the essence of what the company's about. It's less than 300 words, and it's no MBA speak. The CFO can understand it. You can blow it up, stick it on the wall, and a 20-year-old machine operator could walk by and understand everything. It's like, look, you want to, and it's what it's all about day in, day out. And as I talk to my clients, when we get this together, everything you do, everything you think about, everything you spend money on, it lives in this, or it's a waste. And your challenges to everybody, going back to your thing about the thing about helping people help them succeed. How do you help your people help you succeed? That's kind of page one, if you will. Look, you want to get a raise, you want to get a promotion. This is what we're here to deliver. Help us get that. And then it's about and you express those, as I try to stress with folks, it's not aspirational. It's not what do we want to be. It's not verbs, because values nouns. Nobody buys a verb. People buy nouns. So you got to drill it down to what are the things that you want somebody to put in your hand? What do you want them to leave on the desk when they go home at night? What do you want them to change out in the wider world? That's what you got to get to.
What's wild is that you highlight a Gallup finding, a survey, that 55% of employees can't say they really know what's expected of them at work. And you call this like the single most important and underappreciated workplace survey.
Yeah. In the history of all workplace surveys.
Why do you say that?
I think it was in 2018 I first came across, that datum in Gallup. And even, no, it was something before that. It has to have been. But it always stuck with me. And what it really was, in the 2024 results they released, 45% of employees strongly agree with the statement, I know what is expected of me in my job. So when you think about it, that means, 55% of your workforce doesn't really know what you want from them. And when you think about, for those folks who don't embrace, this approach of this appreciation of psychology as we're discussing, this is what it really comes down to. Look, even if I'm completely wrong, fine, or everybody I've been citing, if it's all wrong and it's all real, it's all true, it all works, how can it possibly make any difference if over half of your workforce really doesn't know what the frickin' heck you want out of them? And I will tell you, I'm going to try not to get too fired up about this kind of thing, but over the years, like a lot of your listeners have been involved in bringing in somebody who's really, really fabulous. You throw a lot of money at somebody and you move them and you have all these great expectations on them. And then, a year to a year and a half later, you're putting together the separation agreement because they're just not really working out. And when you look at, and it's another preoccupation of mine, is why do these people fail? What is the biggest reason? And what I've come to passionately believe, I can't even remember if this is in the book or not, sorry, but I really, really believe, especially what's true, the further up you go in an organization, the single biggest reason why people fail is because the people that put them in those jobs really didn't know what the hell they wanted out of them in the first place.
Yeah.
I really mean that. I'm not just being cute. They just really don't think through, what do you want? And I really also believe that what's missing about what do you want, it does come back to, again, not that do. It's not the collection of verbs, because your customers don't buy verbs. Nobody gets a raise for the verbs. It's because we don't think about these things. And 12 months after you bring them in, you walk in and you want to talk about how they're making out. It's going to be this. What do you put right there? What are you delivering? What are you leaving on your desk at night? It's because we don't have those, that we can burn through really talented people and cause them to take terrible detours in their careers that they shouldn't have had to.
Yeah, clarity is huge. And you posed something that's so interesting. I hadn't really thought about it, but you said like the one question every new hire quietly wonders is, what do I have to do to get a raise around here?
Yeah.
And I think like, how do you build that into your onboarding experience where there is clarity around like, hey, look, here's the job. Here's what we're hoping that you do. And like,
Yeah.
hopefully map that out with clarity. And by the way, if you want to up level your career
Yeah.
at some point, here's what you need to do to get there,
Yeah.
get that raise. What, like, how do we do that effectively?
Well, and thanks for asking, because that's one of my favorite parts of this whole thing. I will just tell you, by the way, if I could just share one little thing about this. I do talks, and I bring that up, and including to business presidents. And I say, what do you think that question, the one question everybody has when they start in your company, and probably none of you can answer it. And they all just sit there and they take a few swipes. And like, I do say in the book, there's a kid named Zach last year, one guy that ever got it right. And I say to these people, I promise you, when you hear the answer, every one of you is going to agree with me. And then I say, so that question is, what do I got to do to get a raise around here? And I point out to people, if you, even people that, when they all just kind of sat there, if you're hiring a salesperson and that salesperson asks you, what do I got to do to get a raise around here? What are you going to answer? And everybody chimes in, get sales. Yeah. Why is the salesperson the only person in your organization who gets an answer for that question? And this is one of those things. For years I thought about this, and I always thought, the bosses, they just don't like to get tied down with raises. They're kind of skitty about that. That's the thing. And I thought that was true for years. But, on deeper reflection, I really, really mean this. And this is in the book. I really believe that the reason we don't answer this because they really don't know what somebody could do to get a raise around. And what I mean by that is they know what a job does, but that's all they know, because we don't think about it in terms of, what are you putting in my hand that you give me this and I can get that's worth more money. And that's where this whole idea in the book around success maps, my last day job, I was a VP of HR for a nationwide engineering business, and we redid the performance appraisals. And I really wanted to have a performance appraisal that, structurally looked a lot like this. It was close, but it wasn't really what, I'd come up to what I call a success map now. But I wanted something you could give somebody day one and say, here's your roadmap for success. You want to blow the boss away. You want your boss's job at this level, deliver this. This is where, the 4 levels, we call it on there, the top 2% are doing this. You put enough of these together, you're going to move up in this business right off the bat. We all talk about, the importance in HR of clarifying expectations. But look, nobody takes a job because they want to meet expectations. That can't be enough, right? And we all say we got to clarify the opportunities. All right. How do you do that really? So that day one, I think when you can answer that question, that's when you're really clarifying opportunities. Because here's what you can deliver to get a raise around here.
Well, your book has so many ideas and ways to execute on this value-centric leadership. So I want people to go get the book, but I want to wrap up our discussion with the way you ended the book. And you said, helping your people help you succeed isn't a matter of what's in their heads, according to psychological theories. It's a matter of what's in yours. What do you mean by that?
Well, that goes back to the title. It's kind of a double meaning. If you think, I know some people disagree, but if you think psychology is really helping you, that's all in your head. But the other side of it is, all of these things we're talking about, getting people on the same page, figuring out what the raise is. If you're that leader, that's what's in your head. It's about what is value in your business. Who are the people that you're trying to serve, and what kind of value? How are you going to know that you get it there? And until you're willing to do the hard thinking of answering those, you're going to just keep stumbling. And I can just say, like the business presidents we've been working through, the business, the leadership teams we're working through this, they really do come to see that this is what we've got to have first, and everything else flows from it. But you've got to just be willing to sit down and pull it out of your head. If you can do that, look, we can talk about which box you want to put somebody in, a DISC or the MBTI, whatever. We can talk about those, but we all know also everybody's struggling to find people. And if we're going to just continue, I really mean, this isn't in the book, but if we're going to just keep thinking about staffing and building workforces in the context of weeding out the wrong types, finding this collection of abstractions of personality types and so forth, or whatever that we have to have here, if it's all going to be, who fits the lens, look, there aren't enough people. You're going to really continue to struggle there. In the civil, last I knew, The United States is like short 48,000 civil engineers. We need 150,000 CDL truck drivers. Look, if you're going to just keep figuring this on my little arbitrarily, ultimately, devised model here, you're going to keep struggling. So we really need to seriously think about how do we help people win? Start from that standpoint.
Yeah, Barry, you got a lot of great ideas. The book is very smart. It's well thought out. A lot of sources too. So if people think you're full of it, you've got the data, the research, and the sources to back it up. So I love the discussion. There's so much more in the book that we didn't get to, but the book it's all in your head. Why psychology doesn't help your workforce deliver value and what can. Barry, where can people connect with you, learn more about your work, and follow future work?
Sure. My website is argoshr.com, ARGOSHR.com. You can shoot me an email at bwolfe, it's with an E, BWOLFE, at ARGOSHR.com. And the book's on Amazon, and I got a link to it on the website.
My guest today has been Barry Wolfe. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Brandon. Really appreciate your interest.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on this show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.